Hi, welcome to our lecture on foreign aid. I'm Ben Graham. And I want to start with talking about the fact that we're going to talk a lot today about the relationship between foreign aid and economic growth. And that's because using foreign aid to generate economic growth is extremely difficult, and has proved very challenging and has been met with a lot of failure in many respects. Some successes as well, but a very mixed record. Whereas, another purpose to which foreign aid has very frequently been applied has been foreign aid in the domain of public health, and spreading vaccines and knowledge and antibiotics and things like this. And that has been much more effective, I would say, overall. We started this course, looking at a Hans Rosling video of kind of the growth in GDP per capita and life expectancy in countries around the world, kind of over the last 100 years or so. And what you saw after World War II, well, and actually throughout the 20th century, is that growth in life expectancy surged well before kind of economic growth came for many countries in the world. And some of that was sort of that foreign aid has been effective in that domain, the public health domain, much more so than in the economic growth domain. Um, I like this map that I'm projecting right now is sort of showing where malaria is endemic in the world. And the last couple of figures are projections, obviously, and optimistic ones, but not unreasonably optimistic, I think. That the southeastern United States in particular used to be, malaria used to be a major killer in that part of the country. But, but modern health practices, eradicated malaria in the United States, right? And so, and across a range of diseases, whether that's the full eradication of river blindness or a number of these, polio successes, right? Um, Public health and sort of global coordination and foreign aid around public health has a lot of very large successes to talk about. But now then we're going to pivot and sort of focus almost all of this lecture on foreign aid and economic growth, which has been in many respects more challenging. So the big question that we're really going to tackle today is on this economic side of things, and what should in a moral sense, but we'll focus a lot on the can and the mechanics here. What can rich countries do to help reduce poverty in poor countries, right? So really focusing on this poverty reduction, economic growth generation kind of side of things. And so this lecture really kind of has three parts. We're going to talk about the trade-offs between providing aid through a government versus providing goods and services directly to the population, sort of going around the government, what the trade-offs are between those two approaches to foreign aid. We're going to talk about sort of a bit of an outdated debate between Jeff Sachs and Bill Easterly on kind of the big picture approaches to aid, and a slightly more recent counterpoint to that debate coming from the Zambian economist Dambisa Moyo, sort of the argument that, like, hey, foreign aid for economic growth in particular, in general, may do more harm than good. It's not about picking the right approach. It's just knock it off. Okay, so we're going to cover that debate, and then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of randomized control trials in foreign aid, and kind of the evidence-based turn in kind of the program evaluation turn in foreign aid provision, kind of down at a little bit the more micro level. So we're going to do all three of those things today. Okay. So when we are trying to use foreign aid to generate economic growth, what is it we're generally trying to do when folks come in from the outside, be that a multilateral organization like the World Bank or a national organization like the US Agency for International Development or DFID from the UK? Okay, so often the focus is either on building infrastructure. So a developing country often has a lot of land, a lot of labor, but not a lot of capital. Right. And so you may be coming in and foreign aid is capital that's coming in, and you may be trying to turn that capital into infrastructure. You may be trying to turn outside financial capital into domestic human capital. That's the education side. And also you can view the healthcare provision in that sense too, when we're providing healthcare. So I noted like health interventions as having been among the most successful. Um, those do have an economic purpose as well in terms of generating a healthy, productive citizenry that can work when they are not sick and they're not dying, right? Okay. So we're increasing human and physical capital with foreign aid, which ideally is going to raise wages, promote economic growth, right? So that's the goal here. Um, One problem about bringing capital in from the outside in this way is that foreign aid, in many of its forms, is fundamentally dumping. Okay, so what is dumping? Dumping means selling goods and services for less than what they cost to produce. And dumping is generally banned as an economic practice uh, because the reason firms will engage in this, we see this in the private sector, a firm may sell goods or services at a loss for a short time in order to drive competition out of business. Once the competition has been driven out of business, then they can jack up prices. Right here, the intention of providing foreign aid isn't to drive local firms out of business, but it may in fact do just that, right? When a foreign aid organization comes in from the outside and gives away food, gives away mosquito bed nets, gives away medicines or services for free, it can have the effect of driving local service providers and local sellers of these goods out of business, right? So to provide an example here in the education sector, let's imagine that you're an entrepreneur who runs a private school, right? In a developing country. And, it's not a private school that's accessible to everybody. You're serving the wealthiest kind of quarter of kids in the area that you serve, right? It's something that only the wealthier families can afford to pay the tuition. It's not free, right? And an aid organization sees this and it's like, oh my goodness, there is a quality school in this area, but it's only serving the rich kids or the relatively rich kids, right? There's 3/4 of the population without a school. We're going to build a new school. It's going to be free for everyone. It'll be so much better than the current situation, right? So they come in and the aid organization opens up this free school. Well, this is great in the sense that all of the kids who couldn't afford the private school are going there, but also the kids who could afford the private school are going there, right? Because it's free and it's also quality. And so, okay, now your private school goes out of business. In the near term, this outcome, it's bad for the private school provider, but it seems like it's pretty good for kids in the area because you've got a lot more kids able to attend this school. And even the relatively wealthier kids are now getting their education at lower cost, freeing up funds for other things. Okay. But the problem is if that aid ever goes away, your community has no school, right? That private school is sustainable indefinitely, right? That's sustainable development in some sense. And foreign aid, a big watchword in aid for a long time was sustainability. Can you prove that the intervention you're doing is capable of sustaining itself over time? Precisely because of this concern, the idea that you come in and you provide some things for free or at extremely low cost for a while, knock out all the local providers of that good or service, and then your aid provision collapses and the community is actually left worse off than they were before. Okay, so this is sort of that aid is dumping concern, right? It's also the case that foreign aid causes Dutch disease, right? We just talked about this in a very recent lecture about how Dutch disease works, where you sell oil overseas and then you get a bunch of foreign currency coming in. That currency is converted into local currency to buy local goods and services, and that drives up the value of the currency and makes a variety of industries less competitive. Well, foreign aid often comes in the form of foreign currency that's then spent on local goods and services. It's converted into local currency and spent on local goods and services, and driving up the value of the currency and making a variety of industries less competitive, right? So that can be, and there are ways, to discuss. There's ways to manage Dutch disease in terms of intervening in currency markets to buy up a bunch of, to print, you can print more developing, you can print more of the local currency to kind of keep the value of the local currency from appreciating and some of these kinds of things. Like, so it's not that Dutch disease can't be managed, but it's something that does need to be managed. Um, and then and then here's where we really get to the first one of the first big things I want to talk about, which is the politics of delivering aid via governments or around governments, right? And so one of the starting points here is that poor countries are often poor in part because they're poorly governed. Certainly not always. And we've talked about kind of the large global factors that make economic growth in developing countries difficult. And we've talked about neocolonialism and these sorts of things. But there are, but domestic governance problems, corruption and inefficiency and some of these things in domestic governance often pose some of the hurdles to economic growth. And so if you're coming in with trying to use foreign aid to generate economic growth, in many cases, you're also operating in a domestic political environment that's not ideal for growth. And so as a foreign aid provider, you've got two choices, which I'm going to talk about. It's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Neither of these choices are great, right? The first choice is you can deliver aid through the domestic government. So you give the money to the government, and you may with more or fewer strings attached. Right? You may do a lot or a little to try to control how that government spends the funds that you're providing. Or you can deliver aid going around the government and providing goods and services directly to citizens. Right? So why are both of those options less than ideal? If you're going through the government, like the upsides here is that you're respecting their sovereignty, right? You're working through the national government that has sovereign control of this nation, and you're building government capacity and government legitimacy because the aid comes into the government and then the government is providing the goods and services. Like that's upholding the government's side of the social contract and building their legitimacy. You're building their ability to provide these goods and services when you fund these things. So that's really positive. The bad is that you may actually be creating corruption when you do this, in the sense that government officials aren't accountable to any local citizens for these funds coming in. They're accountable to the donors, right? Not to the citizens. And so, and it's fairly easy for government officials to siphon off these funds into, foreign real estate and various things, right? Where this influx of foreign cash may exacerbate corruption or even create it where it didn't exist before. It's also the case that these national governments may be fairly low capacity at the time they receive these funds. And so you may get relatively inefficient use of these funds from the perspective of the donor, right? So there may be some waste here. And it's also the case that for domestic political economy reasons, for reasons about who has political power in the country that you're bringing foreign aid into, foreign aid often sort of government spending in developing countries and in many countries around the world, right, including the United States, often doesn't reach the poorest individuals, right? That it'll get channeled toward the politically more powerful middle class, right? And actually, Nita Rudra, who's a scholar I guess she's currently at Georgetown. Nita Rudra is a researcher who has some really good work on this and the way that government spending often doesn't reach the world's poorest because they are politically disempowered. Okay, so those are the bad sides of going through the government. So what happens if you say, okay, well, let's not do that. Let's go around the government instead. And maybe you can be a more efficient service provider, right? Maybe the aid organization in question is an expert at providing education service or an expert at building dams and roads or building ports, right? And the donor gets to control priorities, which donors like, right? If you're worried about like, oh, I'm going to give these funds to this government, and I'm going to say they're for education, but they're going to get spent on something else. If you go and build the school yourself, you know where the money's getting spent. So donors may value that, right? So that may be something the donor puts in the plus column, even if from a sovereignty perspective, it's not clear whether that's a positive, right? Or it's not a positive from the sovereignty perspective. So it's not clear whether that's a net positive. And the downside here is that you're undermining government capacity, right? Because when you go in and you build a health clinic or you build a school as an aid provider, you're making it less necessary for the government to run that school or run a school in that community or run a health clinic in that community. And you're actually undermining then the government's capacity to do those things themselves. And you're undermining government accountability, right? In the fact that citizens start to depend on a foreign aid provider for education, for healthcare, right? Rather than depending on their government, rather than demanding that directly from their government, holding their government accountable for the provision of those services. And also, like, if the education provided at that foreign aid funded school or the healthcare provided that foreign aid funded clinic, if that's low quality, who does the citizen go to complain about that, right? There are mechanisms, particularly in a democratic context, for holding their elected officials accountable, but there's no mechanism for them to hold the foreign aid provider accountable. And actually, some of the research that I do has been focused on human rights accountability in the context of World Bank projects, where if there is environmental damage, or if there are human rights violations that occur with relation to a foreign aid project that's funded and run by the national government, right? Citizens, may have tools to hold that national government accountable, right? But how do citizens hold an organization like the World Bank accountable when these things happen in relation to World Bank projects, right? And the World Bank has created some bodies to do this, some sort of quasi courts where individuals and communities can bring complaints. And I've done some work with Kelly Schwabko and Lynn Ta, evaluating the effectiveness of those mechanisms, and the results are like, So this issue of accountability is, I think, a very significant one. Okay. So that's some of those trade-offs, kind of the rock and the hard place, going through governments, going around governments. I now want to sort of shift to sort of some bigger picture arguments about, like, how should we think about aid? And this is sort of Jeffrey Sachs versus Bill Easterly versus Dambisa Moyo are kind of like three major thinkers who kind of, I think, are worth kind of contrasting with one another here. So Jeffrey Sachs is sort of famous as the proponent of kind of a big push notion. He's saying, like, look, the main reason economic growth, we haven't been able to use foreign aid to generate economic growth very effectively, is that we've just never spent very much, like, relative to the size of the global economy and relative to the size of the national economies we're trying to affect. Foreign aid has always just been this tiny drop in the bucket. It was always entirely unreasonable to expect these tiny little pieces of foreign aid, of these little bits of foreign capital coming in to somehow, like, generate economic growth in an entire economy. Just the scope of the solution was just nowhere near the scope of the problem. And so what we need is a big push of foreign aid. If we were actually spending $200 billion a year on foreign aid, sort of globally, we could have transformative development in the world's poorest countries. And for him, long-term planning and coordination are key. You've got a bunch of different interrelated problems in terms of public health and infrastructure and policy and human capital. And all of those things have to be addressed at once in order to generate growth, right? If there's 6 binding constraints that are limiting economic growth, if you just address 5 of them, and then that 6th one will block the growth, right? You need to address everything at once. Okay, so that's the big coordinated push kind of idea. And Bill Easterly says, essentially, that's total crap. He says that big plans are entirely the wrong approach for aid, right? That aid needs to be locally driven, not big sort of not international technocrats, not a bunch of PhD economists from the West coming in saying this is what policy needs to be. This is what the big push needs to look like. It needs to be locally driven, locally tailored. There's none of this one size fits all kind of stuff. And he's saying, look, this planning and coordination itself sucks up scarce government resources and has all these government officials trying to generate plans and run around coordinating with these international donors and talking up to the international donors and not talking down to their own citizens, right? Like, it's shifting accountability from the government toward the international sphere instead of from the government down to their own people, right? It's completely distorting the whole political economy of the countries into which this aid is coming, and it's super problematic. So Bill Easterly is saying, small or locally tailored projects, still lots of them, but locally driven, locally tailored. Okay. And then Dambisa Moyo came in more recently. I think her book on debt aid was maybe 2007 or so, I want to say. I'm sure I'm getting the date wrong. But she sort of made the bold statement that just aid it's not just like, oh, we need to get the approach right, we need to fine tune. It's just foreign aid is bad for economic growth. And so she supports foreign aid in disaster relief, some of the public health stuff, right? But for economic growth, sustained aid, she's like, no. To the extent we have any aid at all, it needs to be short, sharp, and finite stuff in crisis conditions, and then get out of there, right? And she points to a number of the things that that I was running through in the rock and the hard place kind of arguments, the relationship with corruption, so that the flows of foreign capital, of foreign aid, create and sustain corruption. foreign aid is dumping, it distorts markets, Dutch disease. So she sort of points to all these things and say, look, cumulatively, these things are worse, are more significant than the benefits, right? And she also makes a resource curse argument about aid. When aid is a predictable return to being the central government of a country, in the same way that like oil flowing out of the oil wells is a predictable return to controlling the central government in a resource curse sense, then control of the central government is all that's necessary to give a government access to foreign aid. This is going to motivate coups and civil wars in the same way that oil wealth does, right? So, so she makes not just a Dutch disease argument, but a resource curse argument, and she makes it in a compelling way, right? She also says there's a negative stigma of foreign aid for investors, that actually having foreign aid flowing into a country makes other types of foreign capital less likely to flow in. She's saying, look, the foreign investment is much better for growth than the foreign aid, and having the foreign aid actually makes the foreign investment less likely to come in. So again, she's sort of saying this short, sharp, finite aid can be good, right? To come in after an earthquake and help rebuild or something like that. But long-term, open-ended, growth-oriented foreign aid creates aid dependence and does more harm than good. Okay, so those are sort of three big picture approaches to kind of talk about. I also want to talk about sort of that debate is a little bit dated, especially Moyo is a more recent contribution to that debate, a more recent sort of powerful voice in that debate. Sachs and Easterly have been having this debate back into the late 90s, early 2000s. The ethics of randomized controlled trials, though, sort of points to kind of where we're at currently, or I mean, again, this already dates back to kind of 2004 or 5, kind of is when the Gates Foundation was really pushing, started in the mid 2000s is when, and the Gates Foundation I'll put as a major kind of actor here, but it's become throughout the foreign aid kind of industry, is this kind of evidence-based model where of program evaluation, of evaluating, often using randomized controlled trials, which are things, experimental evaluation of the effectiveness of individual aid programs. Is a particular aid program generating the outcomes that it's intended to? And can we measure that in a rigorous way? And so the claim in favor of sort of this real evidence-focused, randomized control trial-focused approach to aid evaluation is that these sorts of randomized control trials, which are the same sorts of trials we use to evaluate the effectiveness of a drug or a vaccine or something like that, they're the best way to know what works, right? And if we're working in foreign aid and we're wasting money, which is to say we're funding interventions that are not effective, that literally kills people. The stakes are actually that high, just like they are with drugs, right? Where we don't want to give people a drug that doesn't work because they'll die of their disease. We don't want we don't want to give economic interventions that don't work, because we'll have people dying of disease and starvation and sort of poverty related illnesses, right? So it's unethical not to test programs fully, right? It's sort of the argument that's made sort of on the pro side here. And this is a lot of folks, I credit the Gates Foundation for sort of pushing randomized control trials at, if you want to get funding from the Gates Foundation for an aid intervention, you need to prove that it works. And this is how they expect you to prove it. But the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, and the scholars kind of running that, or sort of on the academic side, really kind of help develop the technology to run these trials. And I use the term technology loosely in terms of sort of the methodology for running randomized control trials in the field. So what's the counterclaim here? Why do some people say this is unethical? Well, look, I mean, we don't run a lot of experiments in rich countries, right? And certainly not on rich people, right? We don't randomize policy interventions in the United States. We don't randomize who gets access to Medicare to see if it really works, or we don't randomize where we have a minimum wage to figure out, we have a huge debate in this country about whether raising the minimum wage is a good or a bad thing for economic development in our country. But we don't run a randomized trial where some cities get a minimum wage and some cities don't, and that's randomly assigned. And so the argument is essentially when the treatment is valuable, right? When the aid being offered is something of value that really can help people, it's unethical to have a control group, a group that you're deliberately not giving this intervention to. And one of the ways that sort of folks massage the ethical dilemma here is that they will say, look, well, we don't have enough money to provide this intervention to everybody in the first year anyway. So let's randomize who gets it in year 1 and who gets it in year 2 and who gets it in year 3. So eventually everybody's going to get this intervention. What we're going to randomly assign is not if you get it or not, but when you get it. And then we'll use this delay as our way to identify the effectiveness of this intervention. So everybody gets it eventually, but by randomizing who gets it when, we can get a good, precise estimate of how effective our intervention is. Now, this is essentially only relevant for certain types of intervention. We can't randomize things up at the national level. So this is like, we can randomize whether a universal basic income type of a payment is more effective, sort of like an unconditional cash transfer, we call it, whether that's more effective than a program like Heifer International, which provides livestock and training to an individual. So is it better to give an individual cash or to provide an individual with a cow and some training about how to run a small scale dairy operation, right? Like, which is the more effective intervention? Well, we can actually compare those side by side using something like a randomized control trial. Whether it is more effective to build a large port or build a large dam, or whether it's something like that on that kind of scale, that's not really amenable to RCTs, right? So this works for small scale, kind of individual level, local level type of interventions. Okay. This is a lot about like, okay, if we're going to do foreign aid, how do we do it? But if you take the Dambisa Moyo argument seriously, if you're convinced by Moyo, you say, okay, so it's not about running enough randomized control trials to make sure these interventions are the right interventions. It's about like, we shouldn't be doing this via aid at all. So what are some of the interventions, what are, if you believe that there's sort of a moral responsibility for wealthy countries to be taking actions that reduce poverty in developing countries, and you think that foreign aid aimed at economic growth is in many cases doing more harm than good, then what are some of the non-aid things you can do to generate economic growth? And and Moyo would point you at both of these things, I think. It's actually been now a few years since I've read her book. But particularly, she does definitely talk about the trade piece of this, where we've talked about the Farm Bill in the United States, and we've talked about the protection of agriculture in the United States and Western Europe in particular, and Japan as well. And when you have rich countries strongly protecting their agricultural markets, you are harming farmers in developing countries, right? And those tend to be, subsistence farmers and market-oriented farmers in developing countries tend to be among the poorest individuals in those countries. So if instead of sending cash to those individuals or sending different types of livestock or engaging in those types of foreign aid interventions for those individuals, why not just give them tariff-free access to Western markets and stop subsidizing Western producers to outcompete them, right? So if you cut subsidies for agriculture in the United States, if you lowered tariffs for textiles into wealthy nations, right? Because textile workers, again, often some of the poorest individuals in the world, right? So if you opened up trade in those areas that were most beneficial to developing countries, that would generate economic growth a lot more effectively than sending foreign aid to those countries. And then there's the migration piece, and we will talk about, we're heading into the migration section of our course here very shortly, but I want to talk about it as kind of frame it initially as an alternative to aid, in the sense that if you think about if what you think the moral commitment is, or the moral obligation is, the moral obligation is for wealthy people and wealthy nations to take steps to provide opportunity to people who are born with less opportunity. Migration is an incredibly powerful way to do that, right? That poor people are poor because they are born in poor countries, right? Where you are born to a very large extent determines your economic fate in life, right? If you are born in a wealthy country, your odds of becoming wealthy yourself are really quite good. If you are born in a poor country, your odds of becoming wealthy yourself are extraordinarily small. And so allowing people to move from a poor country where their economic prospects are very minimal to a wealthier country where their economic prospects are much better, that's an extremely powerful way to generate economic development for individuals. Right? And it's also the case that when individuals emigrate from a poor country to a rich country and they make higher wages than in that rich country, much of the money they make, they end up sending back home to support extended family members back home. And a lot of that money is invested in education. Certainly it's invested in consumption as well. But that's the source of a lot of income and a lot of economic growth in developing countries, are those remittances. And then there's also this idea of transnational brokerage and foreign direct investment. I have an entire book about this, and this mechanism through which, information travels when people travel. And when people emigrate from a developing country to a rich country, uh, they, uh, they form connections and bridges between that developing country and that wealthy country. And capital flows through those connections, right? That migrants are major facilitators of international capital flows and help bring scarce foreign capital into developing countries. So migration can play a really important role in fostering economic development through a variety of channels. And that's where I'll leave us for today. And I look forward to discussing all these issues with you together in class.